हमारा भविष्य हमारे पड़ोस से जुड़ा हुआ है।
Also, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Sushma Swaraj have met with President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, who could well be the next president of the United States of America. There you can see the bonhomie in those pictures, Hillary Clinton literally hugging and embracing Sushma Swaraj. So that's been another important meeting, along with all those meetings with the US CEOs. First breakfast, then a series of one-on-one meetings. Now to the focus on the buck stops here tonight in our special series, Namaste America. Beyond the optics, what's the real picture? Can Modi convince US investors, US CEOs that he means business, literally and metaphorically? Let's introduce our guests. With me here in New York, Tanvi Madan from Brookings, Manoj Ladva, who's been Communications Director of the Modi campaign, and Nish, Acharya, Advisor to Northeastern University. We're also joined by NK Singh, Senior Leader of the BJP from Delhi, and Kiran Shaw will be joining us from Bangalore, and Diane Farrell will be joining us from Washington. She's with the US-India Business Council. Tanvi, let me get a sense from you first. Great showmanship, now the tough part of the trip. The CEOs meeting, everybody's making all the right noises, Mr. Modi as well as the US investors, but we also had US Chambers of Commerce writing a letter to President Obama saying that the messaging from India is mixed messaging. They're a bit scared that Mr. Modi will not travel the road far enough on economic reform. Given the kind of messaging you've seen so far, do you believe he'll be able to convince US investors?
I think he's definitely making the case. And one of the things you've seen is he's taking on some of their concerns head on, explaining the Indian point of view, not saying everything will be solved, explaining constraints, but also saying there are actually ways to move forward. In some ways, he's been on an economic roadshow, not leaving it to others, but himself saying, I can do this, but it's not just me. I'm going to try and get everybody together to do this because it is important for India.
It's an interesting phrase you use, economic roadshow. Do you think that's essentially what this trip is about, more Wall Street than Washington?
I think it's both. I think there are three legs of this trip. It is business, politics, and the diaspora. And I think all three are important and interconnected.
Manoj, the challenge before the Prime Minister is to resurrect the India story globally. The Madison Square Garden event was spectacular, and yes, there were more than 40 US congressmen and congresswomen there, but in many ways, he was still speaking only to the Indian diaspora. How is he going to go beyond that to actually speak to the Americans?
Well, I think what he's been doing is speaking across these different communities by saying one thing, that in the past, Indian politicians used to come to the West with a begging bowl. Talking about the problems of sanitation and other things. What Modi is doing is saying, well, we still have these problems. Those problems have not gone away. But rather than looking them as problems, he's turning them into opportunities, business opportunities for the West. And I think that's the fundamental difference between Modi and his predecessors.
And how much should we read into the gift of chai to all the CEOs?
I think
is that deliberate symbolism or is just coincidental?
No, I think it's a fantastic touch. Chai is a very intrinsic part of Indian culture, and something.
And of Mr. Modi's own life and of the campaign, the Chai Pe Charcha.
It just puts everybody at ease, and people in business want Mr. Modi to put them at ease, and this is what he's doing.
Nish, what about the specific irritants? You know, the fact is that we've been talking in generalization so far because it's been all about the feel-good factor. Right. Now we're moving into the specifics. Look at the irritants. Nuclear liability, still an irritant. Retrospective tax, still an irritant. Yes. American pharmaceutical companies pushing for IPR rights that I don't think India will ever provide because they say we're a poor country, we have the right to make generic drugs.
Right.
These specifics, how do we get around them?
So I think the reality is that those are very specific irritants, but for a very specific small group of companies. So I do not think it represents the broader pharmaceutical industry, the broader sort of IP-related industries, knowledge industries.
Okay.
These are real issues, but I think one of the values of Mr. Modi's trip is that he's meeting with a whole array of entrepreneurs, of innovators, of university presidents, of business leaders outside of the Fortune 50 to understand where new innovations will come.
And what do you think they're looking to hear from him? Those CEOs that met him this morning, what do you think they wanted to hear?
First and foremost, they want to know that this is an individual they can trust and that he has a team they can work with, that what they say is what they mean, and while short-term goals may not be aligned, long-term goals certainly will be, and we're making progress in that direction.
Let me take this to Kiran Shaw and NK Singh, who are watching all of this from India. Kiran, I'll ask you first. As Mr. Modi said when he launched his Make in India campaign, first you have to convince Indian business. Only then can you convince the global investors community. There is also a debate over whether Mr. Modi has moved fast enough on economic reforms for that messaging to go out globally. What do you think, Kiran?
Well, I think, I think his messaging is very clear. I think he's basically making a very compelling case that Indian regulations for the ease of doing business is going to be a key focus for this government. He has basically said that he is pretty keenly, watching and understanding all the pain points that industry is facing, and he's assured investors and businessmen, whether they are in India or overseas, that these are going to be taken care of. So I think from that point of view, I think he is trying to make a very strong case for manufacturing in India. So I think the Make in India story is getting a lot of traction basically by these very strong signals that he's sending out that he really means business and he really wants to simplify regulation around doing business, and he really wants to focus on the ease of doing business. And I think, as you say, I think if Indian investors are going to start investing in India, I think that actually makes even a more compelling case for others to look at India more seriously.
I want to put a question to NK Singh. NK, there's been a lot of debate around Mr. Modi's economics. What do Modinomics actually stand for? Do they stand for a free market philosophy, or do they stand for a government-enabled pro-business environment? In which case, some of the parallels drawn to Margaret Thatcher, for example, may be a bit misplaced. I think a number of American business leaders are interested in understanding what's the ideology of Modi's economics.
Well, I think that Mr. Modi has explained his own economics. He need not be compared to Margaret Thatcher or any other great leader. Modi economics, I think, that comprises of three critical ingredients. His economics is simple, utilize the comparative factor advantages and the comparative strength of India, which is large elastic supply of labor which could be skilled, whose value can be upgraded, and if some of the handicaps of the ease of doing business and the competitiveness of Indian manufacturing sector can be overcome, India has the advantages of a large growing market which is far from being satiated. He has pointed out about its young demography which can be converted into an advantage, and of course all this in the framework of a democracy which I think has many multiple advantages, in which social cohesiveness in the growth process is kept intact. So I think that he has been a remarkable salesman in some ways. I agree with one of the comments of the panelists that rarely in history has the head of state himself become the chief marketeer and has become the head of the road show. I think he has tried to battle with legacy problems.
Interesting.
Many of these issues, Barkha, which you pointed out, are legacy problems. These legacy problems, he doesn't intend to brush these legacy problems underneath the carpet. He intends to address them frontally. He intends to address them in a manner in which these can be ameliorated in a period of time, but also emphasizing the huge India opportunity and the comparative factor strength and the comparative advantages of India as a large growing market.
Now, what's interesting is that in his meeting with CEOs, the Prime Minister actually made a reference, NK, to the recent Supreme Court judgment on the cancellation of coal block allocations, saying it was an opportunity to clean up the system and to move forward. So is Narendra Modi here as the CEO of India, Manoj? In many ways, as the CEO, that's the term that's often been used for him, not just for his style of approach to business, but also for his style of politics, that it's a centralized, assertive, strongman approach to governance.
I've heard that phrase quite often. He's here as the Prime Minister of India, and what we want from our leaders and our Prime Ministers and Presidents around the world is people that are willing to lead and lead from the front. He is the brand ambassador for India now, and he's saying to the world that, look, have trust in me, I'm willing to lead from the front and put my reputation on the line. I'm here to deliver. That's what we want our captains, whether it's on the cricket field or in the political arena. That's what we want of our leaders.
Tanvi, what do you see as the main irritants in the relationship?
broadly or just on economics?
Let's start with the economics. We'll come to the
Well,
geopolitics.
I think the economics, some of the things you listed, you saw retrospective taxation, you saw IPR. I think across the board, something that Indian business talked about too, the lack of certainty and direction. And I think so that's something US business will be looking for. They realize it's not just, the cricket team is not just the captain, it is the whole set. And they recognize that those dynamics need to change as well. I'd say another issue has been, the IPR issue, and what it says conveys in India that some US businesses don't have Indian interests at mind.
But the Supreme Court of India ruled in favor of the right to make generic drugs, and it would be difficult to convince Indian public opinion that in a country as poor as India, somehow you should not be able to sell drugs at a cheaper rate.
I think you've actually seen that debate and dialogue actually move in the US, where what Nish said, which is that you have actually seen people acknowledge that, including global health organizations here, and actually say, okay, how can we move forward this? It is also a few companies, it's not everybody, but it's the message it sends, and as long as the signaling is correct and there's action, I think you will see this move ahead.
You want to add to that?
I think what Mr. Modi is saying is that rather than India changing, the world needs to change its view on medicine, and how can we bring affordable medicine to everyone. Being based in the UK, we have an acute problem in the NHS in relation to medicine and the cost of medicine. Can India be a hub for research and development? That's the question he's posing, and he's saying that yes, we can. And he wants the Indian pharmaceutical industry to raise to that particular game.
Okay, Nish, you've argued that the business volume, in a sense, the trade could go up to more than $1 trillion. But right now, the Indo-US trade is at levels that are not just low, 1/5 of China, but are actually less than the levels with South Korea, which has a population less than the population of Gujarat.
Right.
So, beyond the fact that there's great cultural identification between India and the United States of America, there's the shared democratic values. Isn't there some problem here?
I think there's a variety of problems in that both countries don't have goals in the short term that are aligned. What we have to look at is what is the long-term goals of both countries, whether it's geopolitical issues like climate change and sustainable development goals, which will occur during Obama's final 2 years, or it's looking at how do we replicate the magic of the 90s with the liberalization and the IT industry's growth. What is the next set of industries where we can see that 40x growth in foreign direct investment and 10 million jobs created? How do we actually focus on aligning our goals in the long term in new technologies and policy change that do get us on the same page on big issues and small? And I'm hoping that when the Prime Minister and the President meet, that's where the conversation starts to really develop, rather than getting caught up in the stuff we hear a lot about in the news. And
okay, Kiran, if I can take this to you. A number of people were disappointed with the first budget, and then they said, okay, let's just give the new government more time. How do you read this government's approach to economic reforms? How do you read Mr. Modi's economic philosophy?
Well, basically, Barkha, I think that Modi is really trying to first fix the various, aspects of the economic framework that need fixing. So for instance, I think simplifying regulation is top of his mind, because I think it is these cumbersome and complex regulations around taxation, around policies, that are actually making it very difficult to deliver on reforms and growth. And I think that's what he's really fixing on. And I can tell you that a number of regulatory simplifications are being addressed. I know that many aspects of cumbersome regulations that surround a lot of the the business aspects are being tackled. I know that SEZ pain points are being tackled very effectively and in a very short time. So I think you cannot understand what's happening under the radar. Today you're only looking at things that are visible to you, but I think below the radar a lot of things are happening. So I think we do need to give the government some time. At least some of the indications I am getting when I see some of the policy changes that are being rolled out, I think are pretty promising. But I think one of the other aspects I also want to mention in this whole bilateral discussions is on some of the comments made on IPR. I think India, for instance, is TRIPS compliant, and I think the messaging from Mr. Modi has to be very strong and clear that India does respect IP, but we are not going to retract on the pre-grant opposition, And I think we are going to stick firm on evergreening of patents and not allowing that. So I think these are the things that we need to focus on. There is only one compulsory license that has been issued, and I think too much is being made of that.
Okay, Diane Farrell of the US-India Business Council joining us live from Washington now. Diane, the visit has already shifted gear very much into the economics aspect. How optimistic is the US business community? What are the specific changes that you're looking for in Indian policy?
Well, certainly the business community is very optimistic as the Prime Minister is conducting his visits here in New York. He had some very good meetings this morning with corporate captains who are talking about what they need to either continue their investment in India or, more importantly, to increase their investment in India. And there's no question that when we're talking about issues of, say, tax security, that the government has shown an indication that they want to provide the kind of predictable and transparent and consistent measures that are going to make it easier for companies to truly do business in India and to evaluate India as an investment destination. The fact that the Prime Minister has talked so much about wanting to increase the manufacturing sector, which all economists agree is absolutely essential for India's future growth, to create the kind of jobs that the Prime Minister wants to create. So Make in India, obviously the announcement last week, very good. His Red Sport speech, very good. And here's a gentleman, because of his experience as a chief minister, who actually understands how these kinds of projects can get done. So there's great anticipation that he's going to be able to apply the Gujarat model, especially as it relates to infrastructure bottlenecks, and to keep manufacturing moving. And that bodes very well from the investment community standpoint.
NK, very quickly, why is it that the government has not been able to move faster on abolishing retrospective tax? What we've heard from Arun Jaitley is, okay, it won't happen in future, but you haven't actually reversed what's already happened.
Well, I think that, frankly, on the retrospective
well, I do think,
tax,
again, you know...
Yes, you wanted to say something.
Sorry, go ahead.
No,
no, NK, go ahead. I'll come back to that.
Our feed is a little bit fuzzy in Washington. Yes.
Oh.
Okay, no,
well,
we'll fix that. NK, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think on retrospective tax, very frankly, Barkha, the government has been quite candid. The government could not do more than what it did. It would have to be a retrospective to a retrospective amendment, if that is one way of putting it. But the government has given a firm commitment that this is it. We are sorry about what has happened. We want to look ahead, no more retrospective. And for the problems which have arisen out of the retrospective taxes, we will find a fast-track dispute resolution mechanism for it. So that's what one sensibly can do. I think give a commitment about the future and try and resolve the past in a manner which would be mutually acceptable. This is a very reasonable way of looking at it. And I think I also wish to say that in the budget has not been as much retrospectively, if you look at disappointment. India's growth rate has picked up. I expect India's GDP growth to touch about 6%. I expect firmly, deeply macro fundamentals being stronger, a daunting fiscal deficit target of 4.1% being met. Direct taxes are looking up, indirect taxes are looking up. Modi and this government has very, very irreversibly reversed expectations, turned pessimism into an optimism in the near term.
Okay. I just want to ask you, Diane, if you can hear me clearly now. There has been a letter by US Chambers of Commerce and certain business leaders talking about the messaging from India on the economic front still being contradictory and perplexing. Those are the words that the letter used. Does the US-India Business Council share that concern that the messaging is not clear?
Well, I think, again, we're evaluating a government that's only now been in office for 100 days. At the time that the finance minister gave his budget address, of course, it had only been about 40 days. So it's still early, I think, to be making any judgments. I think that the principal purpose for groups to want to make sure that issues are raised is just to make sure that as dialogues take place in the next 48 hours in Washington, that they be full-bodied in terms of varying points of view. I think there's no question that the government of India and this Prime Minister understand that they need to be clear and consistent in order to keep the investors committed to India. And so I expect that the more input that the Prime Minister receives over this visit, the more effective his policies will be when it comes to attracting foreign investment.
All right, Diane Farrell, Kiran Shaw and NK Singh, we're going to thank you for joining us on this special broadcast on the buck stops here. We've spoken about the economics. Now let's look ahead at what's actually going to happen in Washington. We're joined now by Toby Chaudhary. He's somebody who's advised many different presidents. He advised President Obama. He's been an advisor to President Clinton as well as on Al Gore's campaign. Welcome to the show. We've been saying that now the showmanship is over, now the real stuff begins. What do you expect to be the focus both at the dinner between President Obama, whom you know well, and Prime Minister Modi, as well as the bilaterals tomorrow?
Well, it's clear that there's a very high bar. The relationship between US and India is extremely important. You can't talk about economics globally today without looking at this relationship. You can't look at security in the world today and not look at this relationship. So I think this is still very much about the Prime Minister's first 100 days or so. And, you know, there are many points at which we grade the Prime Minister, but, you know, they feel a little arbitrary. You know, there's no way to give a grade at day 100 other than incomplete, right? Yeah. But I think this is the beginning of a deeper conversation about how these
there are the cynics, and they're good for reality checks sometimes. We're saying the optics are great, but where's the real picture? What is Mr. Modi going to go back with, Toby?
Well, it's hard to say what he's going to go back with, but here's one thing that we do know, that the amount of energy around this Prime Minister is really high. There's no question that it's probably the first time we've seen a real national message coming from India. And, you know, his message yesterday at Madison Square Garden was very much directed towards his electorate, his supporters, right? Indians in America. That was his biggest audience there. And he was using that to make a message much larger to the US. But it's clear that, if anything, the message isn't really so much about Modi, because he's certainly doing a good job of making a very clear message, packaged very well. His image makers, his storytellers are doing a great job.
You've got one of the image makers sitting right next to you.
Excellent job, excellent job. But the real question is, how do we grade the people of India? How does he go back and actually get momentum for these big reforms that he's talking about? How does he make frontline changes into breakthrough changes that are going to change the face of the country? And in that place, I'd be curious to hear what the grading is of the citizenry in India.
Manoj, there is a danger with overloading one man with the level of expectations that one has with Narendra Modi. Is that something he's worried about as well? That the hype is this high?
No, I think what he's being able to do is to inspire a generation. That's his primary focus, that look, I'm going to lead from the front, but ultimately, as he did in Gujarat, it's up to the private sector and to various other sections of society to raise their bar as well. And he started off very systematically with the bureaucracy. You saw in his first few days reaching out to the bureaucracy of India, who has been the most criticized bureaucracy, I think, in the world in terms of the inefficiencies and the problems that the world perceives of doing business in India. And he said, look, I'm empowering you. I'm going out and saying to the world that India is open for business. Now you guys have got to deliver. There's no excuses. And so through those sorts of interactions is helping to raise the bar and the confidence of the rest of Indian society to say, yes, we're with our leader and we're going to move forward.
Okay, Tanvi, the American media, in fact the foreign media, there has been an unusual level of interest. And I was talking to the BBC correspondent based in New York yesterday at Madison Square Garden. He said that Madison Square Garden reminded him of a presidential nomination night, that it was on that scale. And he also said that the interest was partly because Modi remained an element of mystique, an element of enigma. People are not able to slot him into preconceived assumptions about him. Does that explain the foreign media or the American media's interest?
I think it's interesting because he is somebody who is very much in some ways, and everybody commented on here that his campaign, for example, that Manoj helped, with was very much an American presidential style campaign. It resonated here. That's why people thought, okay, this we can understand. And it was very much like an American political rally yesterday. So I think in some senses, yes, they can identify with that aspect of it. But yes, and I think this is why optics matter. So I think, much as we're saying, let's put optics aside, optics matter because it won't just matter how, for example, Mr. Modi goes away feeling, but how he and President Obama connect. So when Prime Minister Modi and President Obama meet, if they can develop a rapport...
And they're meeting for the first time, unlike his already existing chemistry with Shinzo Abe or Xi Jinping. So it's a first time, it's a getting to know each other meeting where, by the way, he's sipping Nimbu Pani and President Obama is eating, or...
We'll find out tonight.
Toby, is that going to be awkward or is that a non-issue?
Well, I know the President will for sure respect the Prime Minister's fast and his show of faith today. It shouldn't be awkward. I mean, I think many times many people don't like the food at some of these functions, and so they don't
nibble anyway. They nibble anyway. Okay, more seriously, look ahead at some of the geopolitical questions. There's a chance that President Obama may ask the Prime Minister to take a position on the ISIS, on joining the coalition against the Islamic State, as it's called. Do you think that's going to be a difficult conversation, Toby?
I don't think it'll be difficult at all. The Prime Minister has already made it very clear that he is targeting people who are against humanity. He's made that very clear. I think where the tensions come is, how does this meet with the Prime Minister's agenda? I think we just heard a little bit about some of the frontline changes that he's already putting into place and early around getting his government to actually work. But still, this moment for reform in India, there's a very small window of opportunity to actually do these kinds of reforms.
Why do you think it's a small window?
Well, we've seen this certainly in presidential politics here in America, where the president comes in and there's a divided Congress. But I think
can I interrupt you just to say that an interesting parallel with American politics for me, and Manoj, you can come in on that, is that President Obama, in his first term, again, great showmanship, great sense of optics, great sense of his audience, something that Narendra Modi has as well. But Obama's critics would say, but where's the substance? Where's the substance? Toby, are you saying Mr. Modi is running that risk?
Well, he has to show some early wins. It's not, the rhetoric is very important, the optics are very important, it sets a tone, and for that he gets an A+. But now how he delivers on that is going to be watched.
Quickly, Manoj?
Look, one of the biggest achievements of the first few days has been the financial inclusion program, getting 30 million people into the Jan Dhan Yojana into the system. And that in itself has been one of the biggest sense of, yes, he means business and he wants to.
But do you agree it's a small window?
No, I don't. I think there's more impatience overseas than with India. Indians have been, used to politicians not sort of moving forward.
That's true, but the level of expectation. Toby, last comment.
And not to mention this, look, at the end of the day, the politicians, they run to the front of the parade. The people lead the march. The people lead the march. And so how the people of India march is going to really matter here. There's no question that the Prime Minister has the wind in his sails. He has the mandate of the people. He has the confidence of a lot of folks around the world who would have been otherwise
What do you think is the biggest irritant in this relationship? I've been asking all of them that.
Well, I think there's no question that the Prime Minister's focus is India, and the President's focus is going to be not only America, but also the security of the world. It'll be interesting to see how they actually really figure this out around an economic security.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Toby Chaudhary, Manoj Ladva, Tanvi Madan, thanks so much for joining us on the special episode of The Buck Stops Here. Moving on now, you've heard the foreign policy wonks, you've heard the politicians, you've heard the analysts, you've heard the journalists.
हमारा भविष्य हमारे पड़ोस से जुड़ा हुआ है।